very much, everyone, for being here. It's a real pleasure and honor, and I was indeed very eager. I won't say I invited myself, but almost to come and present this very, very early and preliminary work from my new book project, which is on the theme of dignity and historical injustice, with the provisional title of Indignity. And the book is a hybrid, as I will explain in a moment, but the best way to explain the book is to actually read from it. So I'm going to read from the second chapter of the book, which is called The Unmixing of Peoples, and hopefully that will be the best introduction into the theme, and then I'll say a little bit more about the larger themes and what I'm trying to do with the book. So this is, and so I'm going to read from the chapter for about 20 minutes or so, and then talk about the book project for another 10-15 minutes. My name is Leman, but you can also call me Ibrahim Bey. The little girl put the emphasis on Bey with a mischievous expression when the stranger knocking on the door asked who she was. The man, a middle-aged street vendor with a small head barely visible inside an enormous turban, a thin moustache that protruded over the edges of his face, and a slim body that looked on the verge of disintegrating under the weight of multiple sacks, gave her a perplexed smile. Are you a girl or a boy? She lowered her eyes, spotted the multiple stains on the new sailor suit she was wearing for the first time that morning, and remembered her mother's warning to keep the outfit clean. She was not only covered in dirt, but also drenched in sweat after a day of running around in the scorching heat. When she noticed that the eyes of the stranger were on her, she corrected her posture, wiped her forehead, and rearranged the silky butterfly-shaped clip that disciplined the fringe on her short, dark hair. I'm a girl, she replied slightly guiltily. But I was a boy before I crossed the rainbow. I see, the man replied. Mashallah. He too had been racing all day and was still panting when he stopped in front of the large oak panel marking the entrance to the villa. His eyes had a feverish brightness, constantly moving as if in search of a lost object. When he laid down his goods to catch his breath, his hands trembled. The sacks made a clanking sound as they hit the ground. He'd forgotten the delivery was fragile. Lifting them back up with an automatic movement, he poked his small head inquisitively towards the interior of the courtyard. From the first floor, he could hear the loud voices of people arguing, interspersed with the chaotic chirping of birds, as if they had been drawn into an increasingly animated exchange. They said 15 more, their last offer, a male voice that sounded vaguely familiar claimed, before being abruptly interrupted by a second one. 15? 15 is a scandal. They should take at least 25, or better, 30. The deadline is approaching. How will they manage otherwise? No, 15 and no more. They made it very clear. And no luggage either, the first man objected. But of course without luggage. Otherwise everything would sink, and anyway, they will receive all they need once they arrive. An elderly woman tried to reassure them. He recognized her voice as that of Mediha Hanam. The exchange had the familiarity of increasingly animated bargains with customers in the bazaar, but the knowledge that those numbers referred to something else, different from goods on sale, made a new shiver go down his spine. Soon, very soon, he thought. Soon it would be his turn. Indifferent to the noise coming from upstairs, the little girl continued to stare at the sacks with an expectant face that mixed confidence and curiosity. The man waited a little longer, continuing to move his eyes in search of his invisible object, and hoping a servant might soon come out to relieve him of his delivery. When nobody appeared, he decided to address the child. Could you tell Mediha Hanam that Selim is here with the leeches? She's not expecting me, but she'll be pleased. It's my last delivery, he said, opening one sack and pulling out 5 large ceramic jars, which he carefully placed on the ground. I don't have much time. This is my last delivery, he repeated, seeing that the girl was staring at his jars in silence, without rushing inside to inform Mediha Hanam. We're leaving tomorrow morning. He pronounced the last, 2 sentences in a hush, ending with something like a question mark, as if he were trying to remind himself of a message passed down. I'm sorry, because my son keeps sending me this request to allow dates on, as if he were trying to remind himself of a message passed by someone, a truth whose meaning he had difficulty grasping. The girl's face suddenly turned sad. The vendor's message had not been what she expected, and when it became clear that the delivery was also not intended for her, she had to try and conceal her disappointment. It's my birthday today, she declared solemnly, and with a hint of reproach that the servant had not only turned up unprepared for this decisive event, but seemed to ignore it altogether, preoccupied only by his imminent departure, who knows where. Everyone is upstairs, she continued. Even Uncle Rustam has come to see us from Paris. We're supposed to celebrate, but we started late because Papa and Uncle Rustam had to give a deposition to the the subcommittee. And they came back angry, and all day long they've been arguing. That's what the noise is all about. She was proud to have remembered the word subcommittee. And since she had no idea what it meant, she was even prouder to have pronounced it correctly. I've just turned 6. Mashallah, the man repeated in a tone intended to give her the attention she craved, but that remained just as detached as the rest. Happy birthday to Ibrahim Bey, then. She smiled again, then immediately turned serious, as if having second thoughts. Was it a good thing that it made always laugh? That name and that grandfather she'd never met, and about whom the first thing she learned was that her coming into the world had coincided with his departure from it, or even more awkwardly, that her arrival had been the cause of his departure, and as if there wasn't enough space for both in the world. Every year, on her birthday, her father, Avni Bey, declared to the rest of the family gathered to celebrate that she would go on to achieve great things, since already as a newborn she had succeeded where the fiercest Greek brigands had failed, causing the death of the mighty Ibrahim Pasha. On that 6th August 1924, for the first time she had started to have doubts. Surely it wasn't her doing, she told herself. Surely it was Ibrahim Bey, her imaginary other, the boy version, the grandchild that had only ever existed as a result of a telegraphic error, the male heir whose birth had mistakenly been announced shortly before the Pasha's death. If it had been her, Leman Leskovicu, born in Salonika, 3rd niece in a row, the Pasha might not have been as enthusiastic, and his heart would have perhaps not beaten as fast as to stop working altogether. His life would have been spared. But was that even a good thing? Papa was lucky to leave us when he did, she heard her father say, just as Mediha Hanum was entering the veranda, having collected her leech delivery, followed by an army of servants to whom she gave instructions on where to place the jars by simply waving her arms in the air. He wouldn't have been able to take any of this. After the death of the Pasha, Mediha Hanum and her daughter had left Constantinople to join the rest of the family in Salonika, occupying the 3rd floor of a large house overlooking the port in the upper part of town. The house, alongside several acres of land in the nearby seaside town of Volos, had been bought by a middle-aged Ibrahim Pasha several decades before, after he had been instructed by Sultan Abdul Hamid to go into exile in Salonika. An initial minor disagreement with the Porte about tax collection in a remote Circassian village had unexpectedly escalated into a major one about political reform in Armenia, and the Pasha had gone overnight from being one of the Sultan's most trusted advisors to a prime suspect of plotting against the government. They had spent a few months renting a luxurious villa belonging to a wealthy Jewish merchant's family, furnished in the new a la Franca style. Mediha Hanum loved it so much as to exclaim, "Salonique la magnifique," each time she entered the new house at the end of her evening walks by the seaside. Indeed, she found their temporary residence so comfortable as to wish it would become permanent. But since the villa's owners were as reluctant to sell as she was keen to buy, the parties had ended up in a bidding war where Mediha Hanum's victory came at an exorbitant cost, one that could only be justified by her absolute confidence that after countless wonders in the provinces, from the Danube to Syria and from the Circassians to the Balkans, Salonika was sure to be their final residence. But Allah had other plans, as she herself later liked to emphasize with an apologetic smile. A few years after ordering the exile, and perhaps because of developing a better sense of the difference between a real plot and an imaginary one, the Sultan regretted his decision. He sent word that Ibrahim Pasha was now needed in Constantinople to advise the government on the new railway project, and he also sent a reconciliation gift, a collection of 100 canaries in a large golden cage the size of an entire room, which arrived one early morning by steamboat accompanied by a somewhat mysterious note, handwritten by the Sultan himself. Birds have no thoughts, but they always perform the right action: sing. And so Ibrahim Pasha had no choice but to sing, moving back to the capital with his wife and young daughter, leaving his now grown-up sons to look after the properties. Mediha was convinced that the canaries brought the house good luck, a conjectural belief that became a scientific theory after two eventual occurrences. The first one, the Sultan's own exile to Salonika, took place shortly after Ibrahim Pasha's return to Constantinople, when Abdul Hamid was deposed by the Young Turks and sent to live in the Villa Latini, the house of another Jewish merchant, in a reversal of fortunes that, according to Mediha, could only be a providential sign. The second took place the year before they moved back to Salonika, when a great fire destroyed most of the houses, cafes, government buildings, hotels, banks, shops, churches, changing forever the shape of the city. Their house, which was located near Mithat Pasha Street, not too far from where the flames had started, survived almost intact. The whole world is on fire, Mediha had said upon hearing the news from her son. But Allah spared us. For us, c'est Salonique la magnifique. This, rather than anything to do with the practicalities of life as a widow, explained the decision to return to the city 1 year later, exactly when most Muslims were moving to Turkey voluntarily, and Greek refugees returning from the war in Anatolia were found begging on every corner of every street. Selim, the street vendor, is going tomorrow, the old woman announced. He's taking his sons. They couldn't find places for everyone. His wife and the girls will be on the next boat, inshallah. She paused for a moment, then seemed to become terribly upset. Where am I going to find the leeches now? Thank God for the subcommittee, Rustem Bey's continued where he had left off. I must say, there was a bit of a queue, but it was all done very methodically in the end. And those gentlemen from the League of Nations were extremely respectful. We certainly had a chance to communicate our views at length and in an orderly manner, and they were taking extensive notes. Methodically, orderly, extensive notes. Have you been down to the port? It's chaos out there. People are not allowed to take anything with them, so they try to sell whatever they can. You could buy a flat for the price of a ferry crossing. Women are screaming and the children are getting lost even before embarking on the boats, Antony interrupted him, increasingly agitated. I disagree, his brother answered. It would be even worse without the agreement. If they leave people to their own devices, there'll be no end to the bloodshed. You can't rely on the Turks and the Greeks to sort it out. It's good they made a deal. They have a framework now, an international agreement to work with. Without it, we would have had our skin peeled by the Greeks. But they had a framework and they destroyed it. Avni Bey raised his voice. Papa worked tirelessly in his last years. Nobody seemed to want the Balkan League then, even though it was only a small step, a minor technical modification. And look at them now. What do they turn to? The Society of States? The League of Nations? Does anyone know what the League of Nations even means? I'm sorry, I can't see any old nations united in peace. All I see is new nations disunited by war. I disagree, Rustem Bey objected again. The framework is crucial and the agreement is a very civilized way to stop the fighting. You don't understand, you don't live here, Avni Bey retorted, never missing an opportunity to hint at the responsibilities his younger brother had relinquished by moving to Paris. You don't understand, he repeated. There was a framework, and they destroyed it. What else was the port if not what you call a framework? Papa had seen it coming all before the Balkan Wars. Of course, once the killing started, it was pointless, but they never listened to him. His suggestions were ignored because they had no name to make the idea acceptable, as if finding a name would help them solve the problem. Oh, but it does, interrupted the doctor, who had been listening to the conversation quietly smoking a French cigar. Labels are crucial. Without labels, you don't have definitions. Without definitions, you have no categories. Without categories, you can't order anything. It's chaos. A very wise Englishman put it rather well. He called it the unmixing of peoples. But how can you unmix if you don't know what was mixed in the first place? Mediha Hanum turned towards him with an expression of concern. She too had been sitting around the table of the veranda, waving a pink fan made of lace to cool herself, mulling over something which, judging by the contortions on her face and the occasional mysterious motion of her head, she was unable to resolve. Professor Elias, she interrupted him, do you think we can find another black market dealer? I'm very, very worried about those leeches. Dr. Elias shook his head mysteriously, with an expression that made her pause her cooling fan and continue to stare at him in an expectant manner. He looked back, but then continued exactly where he had left off. I have the instructions here, he said, pulling out a piece of paper. He read. The delegation came to the conclusion that place of origin should be taken into consideration first of all. If such place of origin is clearly established by the proofs which the person concerned is able to produce. Thus, if an individual is able to prove, either by means of an official document, or by trustworthy witnesses that he or one of his paternal ancestors came from an Albanian district, the origin of this person should not be questioned. On the other hand, the delegation is of the opinion that it would not be justified in regarding as of Albanian origin persons who vaguely assert that they are of Pelasgic origin, because of such origin, if it could be proved, would not constitute an exclusive presumption of Albanian origin, since the Pelasgians, the ancient inhabitants of Epirus, are the common ancestors of both Albanians and Greeks. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. There we go. Couldn't be clearer. Now think about what you were asked about today at the subcommittee. What are you? He paused for a moment, as if waiting for an answer, and when everyone in the veranda started to roll their eyes, embarrassed by the question, he decided to help. It's a simple question. You may not even know where to start answering. We, us, nous, les juifs, well, we know. We Jews have the same problem. Just think about it for a moment. What are you? Another silence followed. Avni Bey started to cough, first only a small, more like an effort to clear his throat, but then more violent, and when the cough became so intense it almost choked him, he pushed his daughter from his lap with an aggressive movement, and made a sign to the servants to bring water. It seems you don't know how to answer this question, the doctor continued, unperturbed by the reaction of his hosts. But you're thinking too hard. It's just a label, a convention. As a matter of fact, you don't even have to have an answer. You just make it up. It says here, without your answer, those gentlemen from the League of Nations wouldn't know how to implement their rules, and the deadline for completing the exchange is only 4 months away. When you said to them you were brought up as Muslims, but you occasionally spoke Albanian at home, well, there you go. It may be a gray area, but it's still helpful. They can't make up their minds, the framework can't choose for you, so you have to choose for yourself. Indeed, one of the criteria mentioned is national consciousness. He tried to reach again into his pocket to pull out the guidance, as if to confirm he remembered everything well. Professor Elias, not that paper, not those words again, please, exclaimed Medina Hanan. They give me stomach cramps. I'll need more leeches. All right, he replied, but it's a remarkable flexible framework, you have to admit. Well, it's not flexible for the poor fellow who just showed up at the door, Avni Bey objected, glancing at his mother, who had profited from the arrival of servants to instruct them to bring back the leech jars. She had opened one of them and was now intent on counting them. But when Avni Bey mentioned the name of Selim, she raised her eyes with a hopeful expression. That poor man didn't choose to be born speaking Turkish or Albanian, Avni Bey continued, nor did he have a say on whether to sign the framework. And yet, here he is tomorrow, he's off to where he's told he belongs. Every time there's a war now, they'll think it's a good idea to start swapping people around, all in the name of an orderly settlement. Terrifying. And when I think people used to complain about exile in the empire and argue that it was not compatible with human rights, well, good luck with this one. Leman was alarmed to hear that depending on what she chose to call herself, she might find herself packed up on a boat and lose her parents on the way. What are you? She repeated Dr. Elias's words in her head. Was she Leman Leskovico or Ibrahim Bey? Was she a boy or a girl? Was she Greek or Turkish or Albanian? And in any case, why did she speak French? A few weeks ago, her aunt had told her about a place in Switzerland where people spoke French just like them, and where in the summer one could swim in a lake called Leman, just like her. A city called Lausanne, where important people had gathered to sign a document needed to make peace after the war. And that document, Shafiqat had said, once it was signed, it could tell everyone what they were and where they were supposed to be. And depending on what they called themselves, it could be very different from where they had lived before, which is why the port was so busy in the last few months and everyone on the streets asked each other even when they were leaving. But Leman also thought about the silence that had followed Dr. Elias's question. What are you? And about how her father had pushed her away from his lap just when he was asked to answer it, as if it made him uncomfortable, or even angry, as if it was her fault that he didn't know how to respond. She remembered her aunt's word that she had nothing to be afraid of, They were Albanians, certainly, but since they had never lived in Albania before, they weren't exactly like the other Albanians across the mountains, because unlike those Albanians, in her family, they had Greek papers, and they could travel everywhere thought they were Greek. And they spoke Greek just like the Greeks, of course. And of course, Leman knew they weren't the same kind of Greek as the other Greeks, since they celebrated Eid and not Easter. And for Eid, they invited Dr. Elias, who always came unless it was a Saturday, and reminisced about the old days. In those days, before the fire, he would say, the birds sang as loud as the Imam of Hamza Bey Mosque, but when the mosque's minaret was removed, their singing turned sad. And Leman sometimes wondered if that was really the case. To her, the canaries sounded always cheerful. Even when one of them died, there were so many of them left that they seemed to barely notice and continued to sing all the same. Perhaps it was Dr. Elias who had turned sad, Leman thought. But now she understood that there were other people who celebrated Eid, like Selim the street vendor, who weren't lucky enough to call themselves Albanian and simply had to leave Salonika, because that's what those gentlemen by the lake that carried her name had decided. Were they the same people that had invited her father and her uncle to explain? And what if they had become confused, just like she was? What if Avni Bey, instead of answering their questions, had started to roll his eyes, cough, and count his beads like he had done that afternoon in front of her? What if the subcommittee, now she knew exactly what it meant, did not believe their words? So this is the end of the reading. And this is the more or less introduction to the book. There's only one chapter before that talks about the death of the Pashanis in Constantinople and so on. The book is partly of political history, partly of family saga, partly a philosophical text, and an effort to explore the moral and the political meanings of dignity in connection to questions of truth, reconciliation, historical injustice, and the relationship between facts and fiction. The main character of the book is this little girl that we've just been hearing about, called Leman Ülfi, born Leskoviku in 1918, who is the youngest granddaughter of Ibrahim Pasha, a Beyler Bey of Romania, one of the larger provinces of the Ottoman Empire, but she grew up in Salonika, where Ibrahim Pasha had been exiled by, as you heard, the Sultan Abdullah Hamid. She's Albanian of origin, but at home everyone speaks French, and as all aristocrats did in those days, and she's actually never visited the state of Albania until she's an adult. And as a matter of fact, in the year in which she's born, 1918, Albania isn't even a state. Serbia has annexed the north, Greece the south, France and Italy control the rest of the country, and then a few other scattered towns in the west. Bulgaria and Austro-Hungary content other territory. She was sent to study in the Lycée Français de Salonique, where she was the only girl in this school of mostly Sephardic Jews, with whom the family used to hang out. And it was only at the age of 20 that she travels for the first time to Albania, which by then is an independent state and recognized by the League of Nations. She's the first woman to work in the Albanian administration, and a few years later, she's married to my grandfather, who is born in Manastir, modern-day Bitola, a law graduate from the Sorbonne and a card-carrying socialist who sympathized with Leon Blum and campaigned for the Popular Front during his time in France. And this is partly also, this story is covered in the middle part of the book. In 1946, the last part of the book, the war is over, and she's taken up Albanian citizenship and participated in the elections from the Constituent Assembly, which are the first elections in which women can vote in Albania, and the last ones in which non-communist candidates are able to run for office. Within a few weeks of that, her husband, Othon, who is a social democrat, was arrested and charged for agitation and propaganda for having collaborated with British officials who were part of the special operation in Albania. In fact, I recently found a memoir of one of the people that had been hanging out with them and who is mentioned in his files. And sentenced to 15 years in prison, a year later, a file on her is opened by the Security Service branch of the Interior Ministry of the Socialist Republic of Albania, and she was placed under strict surveillance, suspected of being a Greek spy. She was deported before reaching the age of 30. At 32, she started working in labor camps, and by 40, she had lost both parents, as well as many relatives who had ended up in mental hospitals or in exile. And twice a year, she was able to visit her husband in prison. 4 times a year, she was summoned by security officers with an offer to become an informant, which she always rejected. So in the book, her story is told by relying on two distinct temporal narratives and also two distinct voices. There's a first-person narrative in which I talk about the experience of searching for the truth of her life by narrating a series of visits to the archives of the Communist Secret Service and opening the files related to the family history. And the perspective on that one is an intergenerational one. It's focused in the present. The narrator writes in the first person and tries to juxtapose expectations and finding and hypotheses about what happened to her and why. And the problem of dignity, which is at the heart of the book as a philosophical theme, is from that perspective closely related to this question of truth. You know, why was she placed under surveillance? Who spied on her? What reason did they have? What justifications did they give? And in many societies that are divided by the legacy of the past, there is this widespread belief that knowing the truth about how different families experience this oppressive system and how individuals collaborate to maintain the system will help restore the dignity of the victims. And only once that has been done, is the argument, the next generation can begin the process of reconciliation. But as this part of the book tries to show, this only works if there is a truth to find, and if you can trust the mechanisms through which that truth is transmitted. And the account that emerges in my book, and that has emerged from these visits to the Secret Service archives, is actually much more unsettling because the archives contain very little objective data. And by the end of the book, you actually find yourself asking how you can tell the story of a life that is conveyed to you through that mechanism, and even whose life is it that you're narrating in the first place. And you discover that there is no truth without interpretation, and that the different interpretations are themselves the product of historical contingency. So that's where the third person narrative becomes important. You try and imagine what her life might have been like. And so you follow this character through her childhood in Salonika to her adulthood in Tirana, and you see how she becomes her own person, fighting for her dignity. And it's her life, but it could be of any life, of any woman born in those families, under those circumstances, making the same kinds of decisions at these same historical junctures. And her life is reconstructed, but also imagined with the help of family records, with historical materials like letters and memoirs and newspaper articles and so on. And so the text reads like the kind of text that I've just been reading to you, where you have a plot and character, and those are instrumental to reconstructing the context and to explain how this woman finds herself at the mercy of authorities in Albania at that point in time, and how she ends up betrayed by a state with which she has identified, or she finally returns to, so that she can find a state to identify with. And at the end of the book, these two perspectives, the present-oriented one and the past-oriented one, converge and lead to a more general philosophical question around what is dignity and how can you relate it to moral agency, and also the relationship to the facts of the literary imagination. And now I'm going to say a little bit more about why that's connection. Initially, I was planning to write a book only in the third person, and through the project of writing this novel or historical novel inspired by the life of my grandmother, and the book was going to center on questions of state and nation building in the Balkans, discussing topics of individual and collective identity in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and in relation to the interwar period and to World War II. But when I started working on the book proposal, I traveled to Albania to go to the Secret Service archives, and I came across a lot of mistakes in the files that were presented to me as the files about my grandmother. And most puzzling of all was the fact that my grandmother was reported as a widow, and there were no references to her having a child, that's to say my father. And also, the file was closed with a death certificate in 1953. Now, my grandmother died in 2005, so that was obviously a mistake. So when I asked experts about this, I was told that these are very common mistakes found in the files, and that the Secret Service collaborators were themselves under pressure and often invented information just to have something to report on. And when I talked about this with my mother, she had a more different interpretation. She said that following my grandfather's arrest, it was likely that she was just declaring that her husband was dead in Salonika, so that people wouldn't know that she had this, that she was married to this political prisoner and that she had a child. And then later, when I explained, but when I asked, but what about the death certificate? She said, oh, she had a cousin who knew Enver Hoxha, the communist dictator, and maybe he inserted a fake death certificate to save her from further surveillance. In the end, this also, so I then did a bit more research. In the end, this also turned out to be dubious. And so I discovered actually that there was another Le Mans Duty, another person with the same name, born in Salonika in the same year, coming from roughly the same family, same social background, who had moved to Albania exactly at the same time as her, who was also under surveillance. So since the information I was reading was sometimes very, very accurate and sometimes completely off the mark, the most reliable explanation for this mystery was that there was a filing mistake and that the people who were reporting were confused between these two characters, the grandmother and the doppelganger. And in fact, this was also then further confirmed by the fact that the spy who was reporting on her, was called the Tribune, was his nickname, was actually eventually arrested and killed for false information, for giving wrong information. So I had gone, and so some informants were reporting on her, and other informants were reporting on the other woman, and sometimes they weren't sure about how they were passing information to each other. So I had gone to the archives to find the truth about my grandmother, and what I discovered was just another character and another layer of interpretation. And I also found out by doing more research that this other Le Mans was alone and died alone, and her husband had indeed died in Greece when it was reported in the archives. She had no children and she left no descendants. So in a way, she had no granddaughters who could record her life and to reflect on the meaning of all this and the relationship between truth and dignity and what we find out. But I thought that her life also deserved to be recorded somehow. And so I decided to adopt her and to imagine what her life might have been like. And I thought she also needed to be given the dignity of memory somehow. But of course, it wasn't going to be as reliable as my grandmother's memory. So since the two characters were similar enough to confuse the spies, I thought that instead of canceling one and pretending she didn't exist and immortalizing the other, I would carry over to the rest of the book the blurring of the characters that I found in the archive. And so instead of having to choose whether the book is more fiction or more truth, I would use this incident as a way to explicitly thematize a philosophical theme like dignity with reference to both what you know and what you imagine. And I will also try to find a way through the book of tracing the continuity of history in literature and of literature in history. So this hybrid character, then, that I've been reading and talking about, part fictional and part not, is an interesting figure from which you can explore these questions of historical injustice and reconciliation. But also more generally, one of the questions that I've always been thinking about Schiller's poem, The Gods of Greece, where he says, in your beautiful world, where are you? Which is, how do you engage with division and conflict in societies that are marked by injustices, and we're looking for reconciliation. Her identity is one of a unit that no longer exists, in part connected to this world that is no longer there, the Ottoman Empire and so on. She's a woman in a men's environment. She is a secularist in a Muslim society. She's a cosmopolitan in a kind of nation-building world. She's a progressive throughout the book from a reactionary background, and she's a skeptic, and she's a reminder in a way of how dignity lies in choosing your commitment freely, however much the circumstances end up shaping them for you. So the last part of the book is really a reflection on dignity connected to the Schiller idea that dignity is something that is specifically belongs to human beings, because a human being, as Schiller says, can decide to suffer. And she does suffer. And when she dies, none of the things that she has fought for has actually been achieved, you know. So what I'm writing about is the fact that throughout the book, this constructed character, that, as I say, is part imagined and part real, throughout the book makes moral decisions, resists compromise, is not co-opted by the police, refuses to spy on other people, and so on, makes moral decisions and struggles, but there is no reward, no happy end to her life other than the story that someone else tells about her. And so in a way, this is a life that from the point of view of the individual ends without reconciliation. And that the next generation is faced with the task of how do they tell the story of this life to then reflect on this question of reconciliation. And but the very existence, and so it's the task of the person who reconstructs the struggle to try and make sense of this struggle and to talk about the fact that this is a life of suffering and sacrifice, but it's also a life where dignity is given by the struggle and by the sacrifice. And so this takes me back, just to wrap up, to the central theme of the book in a way, which is the possibility of reconciliation under conditions of present injustice. So in a way, and this is why I connected to this discussion in Schiller on reconciliation and the function of art and so on. Schiller says, you know, all improvement in the political sphere proceeds or must proceed from a kind of ennobling of character. But the question is, how can you, under circumstances of political injustice and divided societies, how does the character become ennobled? And the modern world, which he describes as the world of disenchantment and loss, and a world that is kind of ruled by polarization and inequality, in which gods, he writes, are deemed useless. And Schiller's world is very much like ours in the sense that it kind of obeys only to strictest laws of necessity, and where nature is no longer admired or exploited, and where it's impossible to find harmony. So what is the politics? What is the role of politics? Can one, under circumstances of divided societies, bring reconciliation? And through what mechanisms can moral ideals provide political orientation? My question is that if Schiller is right, and I follow him in that, the interpretation of facts is always the result of ideology and the result of propagandistic manipulation. So the question is, where do you find hope? And my suggestion at the end of the book, and part of the reason for telling the story in the way in which I'm telling it, is that you find hope by turning to art, by turning to the reimagining of someone's life, or to the act of writing, or to the act of making sense of the past through the combination of history and literary imagination. And so I suggest that it doesn't really matter in a way who exactly she is, because it's the interpretation of the story that matters, and the moral light that they shed on the world, and the orientation that they provide. So she's a kind of generic character, half real, half fictional, a sort of influence in my life as a real character, but also the product of a writer's imagination, and in a way a particular human being, but that is only there because it connects you and it enables you to reflect on these general questions. So that's why I say in the end that the instrument of political education isn't accessing the truth, it's the perspective from which you tell the story and the perspective through which you reconstruct the truth, because only art is fully free from everything that is positive or established by human convention or by politics or by this kind of divisive society. And only art can try and bring reconciliation rather than politics. So if Schiller is right, and art is the only sphere that can free itself from political manipulation, you can better understand why the truth about her life and the ultimate meaning of her dignity is only in part about retelling the historical truth about her. Just as important is the vindication of her dignity through this effort to combine literature and philosophy. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. That's very precious and wonderful thoughts. And let's turn to Marilena now for her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Othon, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Leah, for this excellent presentation. I cannot comment the quality of your work enough. It goes without saying. So my brief talk is structured around three main parts. One, the historical context. Two, the key themes of the second chapter and the book. And three, comments about the construction of history and the significant insights of this work. So the historical context. The year 2023 marks the centenary of the Asia Minor for displacement. Specifically, under the Lausanne Convention, Greece and Turkey agreed on the compulsory transfer of their respective religious minorities. Religion became the official marker of identity. In the aftermath of the First World War and the desegregation of Europe's continental empires, the triumph of nationalism and the creation of nation states signaled the rise of minorities as a contemporary political problem, given the presence of various ethnic groups inside the borders of a nation state. A century ago, the northern Greek city of Thessaloniki was a cosmopolitan city, as you described, historically, politically, geographically, and ethnographically. Its inhabitants were Jews, Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Vlachs, Circassians, and Albanians. A cosmopolitan society where Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived as neighbors until its destruction by the forces of nationalism and fascism in the 20th century. How did the cosmopolitan and polyglot Thessaloniki, that we see in chapter 2, turn into a modern city of the Greek nation state? So many examples compose the unsettling of Thessaloniki. One of these cases, a significantly understudied one, is the history of the Albanians in Thessaloniki. So shifting the focus of the existing literature, Lea Ipi offers a different perspective, focusing on the impact of population exchange on an Albanian family in Thessaloniki in 1923. So in light of the fading multicultural character of the city, this unmixing of people is described through selected characters, bringing to light identity, the key theme of the chapter, and unpacking the main question of the chapter posed by Dr. Elias, who asks, what are you? So the protagonist, Leman, is a child when her family begins to wonder where they belong. Do they feel Greek, Albanian, or Turkish? They speak French and Albanian without Leman ever visiting either country. So how do they solve this identity conundrum? According to the historiography, identity is defined in terms of common characteristics such as historical memories, religion, language, and culture. However, in many cases, the defining components of identity are not clear-cut, but rather fluid and interplay. So Dr. Elias, embarrassed by the complexity of the question, added, and I quote, labels are crucial. Without labels, you have no definitions. Without definitions, you have no categories. And without categories, you cannot order anything. It's a chaos. But how can you unmix if you don't know what was mixed in the first place? You wonder. So referring to the Paris delegation, the characters also discuss issues of national consciousness, stressing that one little sign, it told everyone what they were and where they're supposed to live. But we need to note that decisions that did not result from people's free will often cause difficulties in their identification process. So this part focuses on reflective self-positioning facet of selfhood, but also critically engages with externally defined identities by others. So people's identities and their position in the society are perceived both internally and externally, and the terms people use to describe themselves are sociologically significant, as the narration will done. So silence characterizes the immediate attempt of the family for self-identification, bringing to the fore the concept of silence. This chapter fits into a fascinating, I have to add, book project titled Indignity, and following the biographical approach and navigating between philosophy, political history, and family history, Lea Ipi has produced an extremely thoughtful and in-depth account of the possibility of reconciliation under conditions of present injustice. So her book addresses questions of a person's dignity in circumstances of crisis and social transformation, the reconstruction of their life through historical records, the reliability of memory. So to unpack these themes, Lea Ipi draws on family records, letters, memoirs, newspaper articles, history books, government documents, and the book comprises three main parts. The imagination of the life of a woman, the author's grandmother, who was born in Greece in 1918 and died in Albania in 2005, acts as a frame for the whole book. And the book concludes with a reveal of the hybrid character that you described, as the author discovers another Leman and yet another layer of interpretation in the archives. So I would locate the construction of history in relation to this project at the confluence of the following points. So my first point is about memory. The author discusses private memory mediated through familial frameworks of remembrance, collective memory and cultural memory, or the national narrative that concerns the society as a whole. Can you tell us more about the interplay of these levels in circumstances of crisis and social transformation? My second observation is about silence. Constructing history is about remembering, but it's also about forgetting and silence. Many voices have been silenced in historical records. What is left out and what is recorded? What is remembered and what is forgotten? And what does silence reveal about the reconstruction of history and dignity? Silence is under the process of construction of history in different ways, from the making of the archives, the sources, the narratives, the making of history in the final instance. So in some cases, the concept of silence pervades the remembrance of different generations and leads to a non-linear and not directly referential transmission. You stress the issue of objectivity of the archival sources, etc. But how are you dealing with silence in the family sphere? My third point concerns subjectivity and agency. Subjectivity, memory, and story are closely linked here. And through this approach, complex identities are unpacked in the depth of different contexts in which individuals make sense of their past and reconstruct their stories. Given that the story of Le Mans is told through two temporal narratives, and it seems that temporality is also an important issue here, I was wondering if you could talk more about the agency of the protagonist and the blurry boundaries between fact and fiction. And my fourth point is about memory of trauma and its intergenerational transmission. So, stressing the limitations of the factual search of truth, you refer to the next generation and the process of reconciliation. Given that trauma is both the event and the memory of the event, what is the role of trauma in its transmission, if any, in your story? So this is a fascinating story about Le Mans, and the author noted, and I would also quote, "It could be any life of any woman born in a similar family at roughly the same time." Indeed, the variables of gender and class are rooted in this story. This story brings to the fore historically informed subjectivities, complex and divided over time within social, political, cultural, and gender contexts. Concluding, by drawing boundaries within intermingled populations through forced assimilation, large-scale human displacement, mass killings, nation-states were built on triumphs and catastrophes, shaping collective memories central to ethnic identities. The author's original work foregrounds dignity in circumstances of crisis and social transformation, enriching our understanding and offering a fresh perspective about the divisive legacy of the past, identity and belonging, and the reliability of memory. I'm very much looking forward to reading your exceptional book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marilena. Would you like to respond?
Maybe just briefly to two things which might maybe help me clarify even a little bit further the project. The first is this question of how do you negotiate between individual and collective memory, and that was the question that was exactly behind my thinking when I decided to write the book in two voices. So the voice that is in the first person, that's personal, that's about me, it's in the present voice. I go here, I see this, I meet this archival, and so on. That's all individual, and the character that is there in that voice is my grandmother. And all the story about searching for the truth of her life and so on, that's an individual experience, an individual memory that is navigated in that voice. When the voice of the book transitions to turning into the past and is written in the third person, as this chapter that you've just heard, Daman and so on, the writer is not there at all or tries not to be there at all. And the evidence and the dialogues, they are all true insofar as they're reconstructed from historical records, but not necessarily individually true. So when I say, my grandmother had coffee in this cafe in Salonika here, that cafe would have been there and people would have had that kind of coffee and they would have been talking about the kinds of things that the dialogue is talking about, but it's not obviously a dialogue that I witnessed or that I have evidence of. And so it's a generic character in that it's reconstructed with the help, or when the character in the chapter that I just read, to give an example, when he pulls a piece of paper and reads what the subcommittee instructions say, those are the instructions that the subcommittee was receiving that are found through accessing the United Nations archives and the Lausanne Treaty papers and so on. So everything in that part of the book that is written in the third person is based on generic historical evidence, as it were, but with the idea that that perspective is limited as well because of the discussions that I just had about the archive and the difficulty with accessing the truth in the archive and the difficulty of separating, the ideology of the people who are even compiling the information in the archive. And of course, that was true in communist Albania as much as it's true in, Lausanne Treaty Archives or United Nations Archives. The intentions of the actors that are acting for the motives of a certain era are always there, and you can't really have this faith that, when you go to the archive, there is this element without any layer of interpretation. So this is what the book tries to do. It moves, there's a chunk of chapters written in the past based on this historical record, and a chunk of chapters that are written in the present based on the more family memories and more individual and so on. And the question about so how do I deal with the silence? I don't think there is a good way of dealing with silence. I mean, you fill it with words in a way, and so you can't leave it there as silence. You have to make it speak somehow. And I guess I hope that I make it speak, or try to make it speak, in as less biased a way as possible by acknowledging from the beginning that it's incomplete. And so even though the book is, in the parts of the book that are fictional, by acknowledging that they're fictional, they're in some ways more true than if they were true and they were, and where the truth, you think you have the truth and the truth is a lie. Whereas if you already say that it's fictional, then there is more generic truth to it than, and this is also partly why the book is in some ways trying methodologically to think about the boundaries between literature, history, and philosophy, and to poke at those boundaries and blur them, hopefully in a way that is somehow aware of the difficulty of doing that, but in a way that also hopefully makes use of them in a productive, of this knowledge from these different disciplines in a productive way. The other question is the agency of the protagonist. So again, the protagonist is a generic character, and I'm really interested in this protagonist, apart from the fact that she's my grandmother and I'm affectionate and I miss her and she was very important in my life. So apart from all the individual elements, I'm really interested in telling a story about dignity that is the kind of story that I was trying to emphasize towards the end of my talk, which is about how dignity has to do with moral agency, and with the affirmation of moral agency in adverse circumstances without thinking that the circumstances will reward you in any way. So for me, moral action isn't about expecting happiness or expecting to get the right thing or expecting the right outcome. It's about doing something that's difficult, knowing that it's difficult, and that's where you find your freedom. And this is partly why the book is in some ways a development of themes from my other book, which was all about different conceptions of freedom, and where my grandmother had this more Kantian understanding of freedom. And this book tries to unpack, well, what does that look like? What does this freedom as moral agency look like? And the example is this life that is lived in conflict and adversity. And so maybe I should stop here.
It's right. We've got 40 minutes for discussion. Before I would like to add one very small comment, in the sense that I believe that, my personal interest is also very much about political history. What your book, in part of what it's doing, it's also really giving a voice to the Albanians and the others that were living in Greece that we don't hear much. We know very much about the exchange of population. We know the Greek perspective. We know the Turkish perspective. We know a little bit about the Jewish population of Salonika, but that historical value of learning the other voices as well is very, very important. And it's also important for contemporary reasons too, because there's been such a big number of Albanians coming to Greece after 1989, and how that is linked with historical memory. Possibly it's not, or partly with some of them, the return of some Albanians probably as well. I think that's very, very important that you're doing this. I've got two very quick questions for you. My first question is, how much of your grandma's memory is in there in terms of you speaking with her, having conversations? She died in 2005. You had plenty of opportunities. Were you conscious when you were talking to her that you would like to use this information at some point? Did you get a lot from her own experience? That's my first one. And my second is, when you were reading this, writing about this fictional character, true and fictional, about this part behind the character, I mean, did you have a conception that, what I'm writing now is actually true, or what I'm writing now is false?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the second question. When I started writing the book, I was hoping that I would find the truth in the archives. And actually that is very much the dominant discourse in contemporary Albania about his archives from the Secret Service and surveillance documents and so on. Everyone goes there thinking, I'm gonna go there and I will find who spied on my family, why did they spy, what did they say, what way did they write it, and so on. So I wasn't at all prepared for the incompleteness of this. In fact, I was really shocked, even physically, when I saw the file, what they looked like. You just come from different age, I think, and you just expect something, and you turns out the document just looks much more messy, and there's drawings, and someone was getting bored at work, so it's making it do those. It's just like that also visually. So that was already preparing me for something. But then as I was going on and searching and finding these mysteries, birth dates that were wrong or names of relatives that didn't really remind me of anything, that's where I started digging further. And of course I found this death certificate, which was the thing that really tipped me over the edge in terms of thinking, oh really, it can't be that wrong. And so, which then made me search further and come up with find this other character. And incidentally, my grandma's name is not so common, so it's really rare to have someone who has the same name, the same surname, from the same city, and it's not that, you're called, I don't know, John Smith or something. You just go and find hundreds there. It's not the case, and it's very likely that they were related, because this particular surname is also one that is connected to this particular family with a special history of people that came from southern Anatolia when Mehmed the Conqueror was sending colonists to the Balkans in exchange for their loyalty, and so that's another very complicated story. But anyway, I haven't got to that part, and I don't think I will in this book, because otherwise it just opens up too much. How much of my grandmother's memory is there? It's a very interesting question, because again, I never knew that I would become an academic or write the family history, or so whenever I talked to her, the things that I picked up from her were things that she kept emphasizing, and this is actually connected to the thing that Marilena was saying about trauma. I was aware from a very early age of a population exchange, but I had no idea, I couldn't even conceptualize a population exchange, because if you're born all your life in communist Albania, live all your life in communist Albania, the way we identify with the state is so exclusive that just the image of these people that are swapped, one goes to another country and there's a whole group of it, and a compulsory population exchange, it's just not really something that you can conceptually grasp, even as an adult now, I think, let alone as a child. So, but I was very aware that this was an important experience, because she was talking all the time about this. We lost our contact with the population exchange, or we lost contact with this aunt because she declared herself. This was the other, the peculiarity of the Albanian population in Salonika was that they could choose. So they could either declare themselves as Greek and have Greek papers, or they could declare themselves as Turkish. So all these families were split. Some of them decided to go to Turkey, and it turned out much better for them. So there were a lot of intergenerational animosity as well. The whole experience was really foundational. The other example, from a very early age, again, my grandmother was saying, I spoke Italian because I speak Italian because I spoke Spanish. And you think, why did you speak Spanish? And of course, it wasn't Spanish, it was Ladino. So she could, because she was hanging out with these Jewish boys in the lycée and in the school and so on, she had been socializing with them. These were all her friends. And the way she explained it to me was to say, oh, I spoke Spanish as a child. And why would you speak Spanish in Salonika? So it was these things, these elements of history that you don't really know when you're young, but that you somehow have absorbed that it mattered, that it was a kind of trauma, that there was a trauma there, that it mattered to this person. And this is also how I decided to reconstruct the historical bits of the book, but just trying to remember what were the things that she had told me before I had any historical or philosophical awareness about her life. Just sentences or things like, I don't like the Greeks. How could you be born in Salonika and lived in Greece and had Greek papers and come as a Greek citizen and say, I don't like the Greek? And of course, I had this huge resentment towards Venizelos and the campaign of Hellenization of Salonika. And so these were all traumatic memories, all of which I then tried to kind of piece together the story from.
Great. So there are 3 hands here, and you also, but let's start with you first.
Well, thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. What is reconciliation?
I think of it as the process of making peace with the past. And I think that's the way in which it's
What does that mean?
With making peace
Yes.
with the past. Overcoming or finding ways of forgiving oppressors or perpetrators, or
So it's
think about historical injustice in a way that is no longer divisive, that doesn't result into people carrying forward these animosities through one generation.
So it's pardoning, essentially.
Element of forgiving in it, but I don't think it's just that. It's more, reconciliation is more than just forgiving. I think it's literally understanding as well as forgiving. So putting yourself in the position of someone who has a different role in a particular historical process. and trying to explain, how did these obligations that were associated to that role come from, and thinking about, I guess, taking a larger perspective on the longer historical process than the one that just being someone who is a victim or who is connected to a particular position in that process enables you to do.
I wonder if you could unmix for us the concept of the unmixing of peoples. I'm assuming you're referring to Lord Curzon's phrase in the wake of World War I, so in the context of the Ottoman Empire. But I would argue it's a phrase you could apply to a very large portion of European political modernity itself. So I'm just wondering how you use that concept in the book. It's obviously very striking. It's a very compelling phrase, right?
Yeah, yes, it is indeed a reference to Curzon. And in fact, there was even an explicit mention, and then I decided to cut the explicit mention to leave the concept. And I think it does apply more widely, because I think the history of Europe is really not the history of these homogeneous nation states that we think, that it is. In fact, if you think about the dismantling of empires, whether it's the Habsburg, whether it's the Ottoman Empire, whether it's the Russian Empire, all of these empires that disintegrated, which actually even territorially were a large part, indeed the majority of the continent, all of them involved this unmixing of peoples, in the sense that there were this enmeshed structure, jurisdictional authority combined with cultural elements, with linguistic elements. None of this was clear cut. So the fact that you have a nation, a language, a state they were all dispersed. I mean, of course, there were concentrations, and that also explains why they decided when these territories became nation states, why the nation state has these boundaries rather than other boundaries. It's not entirely arbitrary, but it was much more complicated. And one of the things that I wanted, and this is why it's so important also just going back to what Othon was saying about telling the story of Albanians. One of the things that was really important to me in this narrative was the fact that the dominant way of writing the history of the 20th century for all these populations is to say there was this desire for a nation state that was always there, and there was an identity that somehow preceded the construction of the political identity, which of course it was to some extent for the elites, for some people, but it wasn't for everyone.
Yeah, you do it the other way.
And so what I'm trying to do is to explain how this identity, there were some of these groups on whose an identity was forced. And the case of my grandmother, my grandfather's family is very different, because they were already very aware and very nationalistic, and they really cared about Albania and this idea of independent Albania. The moment the Ottoman Empire began to crumble, they already had a sense that they wanted to have an independent Albanian state. But the Albanians of Salonika weren't necessarily like that. They weren't that connected to this myth of Albania, the nation state. So I think it was a much more complicated history, and this is what I try to convey with this notion of the unmixing of peoples, was the sense that sometimes cultural identity building isn't just following a dream, it's literally imposed on you by the nightmare that you're living in.
It would be a good title for the book.
Yeah,
Controversial, but a good title.
Yes. Right, I think I'll continue on that theme.
Speak
Yeah. Something that stuck with me is one of your characters mentioning the concept of human rights early on in the presentation. And I'm not mentioning this to be annoying about historical accuracy, but at this point in time, there are humans that have rights, but human rights is an established concept, right? It's still being negotiated.
Yeah.
What I want to ask on that kind of vein is, what kind of a discussion do you have between human rights and dignity? Because both are dense terms, and the intersection between the two aren't necessarily as obvious for people living at that time as it would be for us today.
Yeah, so you're right. I actually had it as rights of men. I don't know why I read it as human rights, but it's written as rights of men. The version Marilena I read it was rights of men, so that was just a lapsus. And as I said it, I was like, okay, I'm not going to correct it, but I knew someone would pick up on it. I think dignity was, I knew dignity, I think, and human rights are connected in that we think of human rights as attempts to codify human dignity and to kind of legalize them and to give them a positive body of norms that you then associate. It's often said that dignity is the ground for at least contemporary discourse on human rights. But the conception of dignity that I'm working with in the book is not one that is ever actually reducible to positive doctrine, law, or that can ever be codified. For me, it's something that has to do with the moral dimension. That isn't something that you can ever fully capture by law or by positive norms. And I think that's where the difference is between the foundation of dignity in this legal contemporary discourse and how I think of it, which is much more metaphysical and moral.
Thank you.
David?
Thank you very much for an extraordinarily interesting talk and very rich subject. And I have to admit, this is a comment rather than strictly speaking a question. And thank you, Marilena, for a very good first response. But I'm sitting in a place where your talk has been added resonance by the fact that just above your head on the map behind you is Thessaloniki. And, you know, your whole story falls into place from the map behind you. We have Greece, we have Anatolia, we have Albania, and good heavens, we even have Spain, where a lot of the Jews came from. And best of all, we have France, which produced the language which a lot of these people spoke, even though they had never been there. What an extraordinary history.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, at the very, very back.
I was very
And yeah, I meant you first, and then like
I was wondering how the experience of writing is different to your experience of writing.
Sorry, I missed, can you speak up a little bit?
Wondering how the experience of writing this book is different to the experience of writing free, particularly as when it comes about dignity and about memory and post-memory trauma. I'm thinking about how it's different when you talk about yourself and your post-memory, your own experience and your own thoughts, whereas now you're trying to understand your grandmother's face.
Yeah, great. So there is a part of the story in the book which is about how I decided to write this book, which is a story that goes back to discussions on free on social media. So some people may or may not know that the book had some controversy around it in Albania. And at some point, someone put out a photo of my grandmother taken during her honeymoon in Cortina d'Ampezzo in 1941. And it was a photo of her I had never seen before, who was posted on someone's Facebook wall. And then there was a pile of, it went viral, and there was a pile of about 100 comments of people saying, is this the grandmother of the communist Leauki? And isn't she supposed to be an anti-communist? And how did this rose produce this terrible poison? All kinds of things. And, you know, and then discussions around how Allah would punish me. And so it comes kind of from all angles. But it was, again, I mean, so when I was reading these comments, for me, it was very interesting because the photo was a photo that I had never seen before. And the reason was that the photo was kept in the Secret Service archives. And I had no idea that there was evidence of this period of her life, because she had always told me, we have no photos from the wedding. I have no photo with your grandfather when we were young, because the communists took them when we were dispossessed and when he went to prison and so on. So clearly the photograph that had become viral and that kind of circulated on the Facebook was of someone who had access to these files and had pulled it out. And this is how the book started, as a search for the photos, which I still haven't found, because the person who posted it keeps saying, I found it on the floor, and if you just go there, you'll find it. And I've been there 100 times, but I haven't seen anything. There's definitely nothing on the floor, because they don't let you go and check the floor. They give you a computer with all the files. And so it's a very, very different experience. But the starting point was in some ways connected to free, because I was following it was connected to the reception of free and this disjunction between me, now a person who is writing about memory and about communism and the point of view from which he's reconstructing the history, and then this other community in Albania who felt that they'd been aggrieved and, you know, unjustly treated by this story and so on. So that was very much connected. So the starting point was connected. The writing process is very different, and I find this book much, much harder to write, and also a lot more work, actually, because, and I'm sure a lot of historians will be familiar with this, you have the embarrassment of riches. You know, you go and you find there's too much, and then there's not enough, and then you have to make these methodological decisions of what to cut and what to keep. You go down rabbit holes because you find something really interesting about the Jews in Salonika, and you suddenly forget you're writing about the Albanians and start thinking about the Jews. So there's always, so I find that both the disciplining and the research very difficult. And then I also find living, or in this, especially in the historical part of the book, where I'm talking about these characters that lived in Salonika in the interwar period, inhabiting their point of view really, really difficult. Because again, you know, just we have the concept of human rights, but we don't have the concept of minority rights that they might have had at that time, and how they were thinking about it. We have values that we think are generalizable, but you don't know that they would actually be the values of the person writing in Salonika at that point with this historical experience. All your interpretation of the world is shaped by your own upbringing and by your own education. And so putting yourself in a position of these characters with these very different experiences, none of which you have direct access to, and all of which you have to reconstruct from files is, I find, very, very hard. And so in that sense, it's different from pre because it's just a lot harder, actually.
Okay, let's take two at the back because, yeah, your turn.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your reading. And well, I noticed the thing that jumps out about it is the level of granular and enthralling and detail that is part of the book. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind commenting a bit on how that kind of writing, that style of craft contributes specifically to the investigation of political theoretic ideas. So I guess the advantages of this kind of craft of getting to come to fiction and literary work or that kind of exploration.
You're definitely jumping from fact to fiction, discipline to discipline. This is definitely a challenge. Can we take one more from the back? Okay, yeah.
I just say appreciate your support, and that's not very numerous and your true inspiration. But my main question was, so it's a fascinating media, obviously, there's it extremely positive voice and sensitive, but there's maintenance of any identity. And my question is more to, findings, why do you think there was such an emphasis to maintain that Albanian identity? Even to this day, we find Albanians are very consistent and very passionate about their Illyrian blood and this whole rhetoric. So, how do you have it? Thank you.
Can you repeat it?
Could more, okay?
Or could you just repeat it?
About why are Albanians so passionate about their identity? Well, I mean, I think all small nations have to be passionate about their identity, otherwise they disappear from the map if they're not passionate. So I think there's a very, pragmatic, instrumental argument that you could give to that, which has got nothing to do with how we think in this ideal world about, the dreamland and so on. It's simply that if you don't identify with something, then you just won't exist. And not just as a nation, but also as a person, because usually these things are connected. I also think that the Albanian identity was obviously constructed like all other identities in the 19th century with historical elements. And part of the story that I'm trying to tell is about how identity is both valuable, but there are moments in which it's a burden. And so in the case of my grandmother, it was valuable at the moment in which it released them from the crisis of emergence from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and knowing where you belong. And so it liberated them because they could associate to this country and they could visit this country. And this is also partly why the themes of dignity are connected, because the idea of the nation gave dignity to the individual. It finally gave them a place in the world. But in her case, very quickly it turned into a curse. She ended up in Albania as part of this idealistic generation who thought they would build a state and would become a progressive state. And then, her husband was in prison. She was deported. She had this horrible life, and there was no reward that came from being Albanian other than being constantly surveilled on accusations of being Greek by the secret service, by the Albanian secret service. So there was no, in a way, again there as well. There's no rosy picture of identity. It's a case in which identity, national identity, is a burden, and for an entire generation of people, it was a burden. And this generation that I'm trying to write about, were a part of them idealistic and arrived in Albania motivated by this dream of their ancestors to have their own state and so on, and a part of it completely instrumental and pragmatic and not really for, wasn't there because they had ever had this dream of the nation. It's just that this was a nation that was giving them a home at that point. And that's partly what I'm also trying to capture with the book. So the first question about the difficulties in the style of writing and navigating between philosophy and literature, it's a really good question, because I find that the concepts that I'm interested in writing are always philosophical concepts, and I come to them because I have a particular position on the debate, say on freedom and identity, and dignity and moral agency. And so I'm not a consequentialist, I'm a Kantian, I want to say certain things about dignity, and I want to almost give an example. And a lot of contemporary political theorists, when they write about philosophical concepts, they just make up thought experiments. And I thought, well, why make up a thought experiment when there is a life there that is like a thought experiment? So you could actually explore the life as a way of reflecting on these philosophical ideas. But something very interesting happens, which is that when you're writing about philosophical concepts in a way that tries to use literature, the worst kind of literature that you could write is the one that tells you what the concepts are and what the ideas are, because it would be paternalistic, it would be forcing a reading, it would be forcing an interpretation on the audience. Just terrible literature. The worst literature is the one that is explicitly pedagogical and didactical and philosophical in many ways. So what happens is that you start with all these certainties about where you want to go with your philosophical theories, and then you start writing literature and you lose all the certainties. And then the literature begins to challenge, and the history as well begins to challenge this world of concepts that you thought you were in firm ground with, and that you indeed started writing about. So I like going back and forth between the two, even though it's very unsettling, because philosophy gives you a lot of certainty and literature and history give you a lot of doubt. And I think the dialectic between doubt and certainty is always a productive one to inhabit, or at least I find it productive. So that's how I try and navigate it, but it's also very unsettling.
And how did you manage as a political theorist into the archives, then become a historian?
Oh, I mean, I've always been an unorthodox analytical political theorist, and that I was always very interested in the archives, and I actually really love the archival work, the finding, the stuff, and the smell and the physicality of the archive, and that's something that I get very excited about. So I think in that sense, it's not. Yeah.
Okay, let's come to the second one. Both activity for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It reminds me of at least part of it, kind of Virginia Woolf's classic gender bending novel, Orlando, in terms of the kind of blending of truth and fiction, etc. I just wanted to ask you about your ideas of art. I was a little surprised that you went back to Schiller, kind of 18th century ideas, which are very idealistic, and the idea that art is the world of hope and truth, that's kind of ground that transcends the kind of grubby material world, etc. But listening to you, I'm just wondering, especially what we think of what has happened to art, the last, since the 18th century, I presume you're meaning on aesthetic education, right? Where art has also become part of the world of political manipulation. It's not really unsullied, it's not really somehow transcending those things, but you're holding out the importance of hope and truth. What you told us is that truth is no longer something you're grasping or celebrating, realize it's just a kind of set of fragments. So I guess the question I have for you is, what do you mean by hope then? Because is it hope for you kind of to reconcile lives that are unreconcilable? Or is it hope for the reader, in a sense, this idea that you're putting together a life that in fact is in shards and in fragments? It seems to be an important philosophical drive for you in terms of the idea of hope in a kind of materialism, this worldly way. It's not necessarily transcendent. I mean, it's essentially part, welcome to our world of historians, this is what we do in terms of the difficulty working with partial and distorted sources. But we do it because in a sense we believe in the idea of some sort of constructed narrative. And as you say, it's art, but it's also about the artifice in a positive, the constructedness is what you're doing. So what's in a sense when you say the hope to do what exactly? It's an effect on you. I presume you want an effect on the reader.
Yeah.
What is that? That thing that you're after, which is going to impart not just knowledge about your grandmother's life, but something bigger in terms of the distance between past and present, between your grandmother's life and you, between a kind of interworlding life and our present. What is that?
Yeah, I think I would say it's the moral sensitivity is what you're trying to develop, but in a way that isn't moralizing somehow. So what you're trying to do is you have this interplay of you're showing in a way conflict, and you're trying to reflect on how history and literature and theology can all contribute to reflecting on this conflict, in this case historical injustice. But I went back to Schiller because he writes something like this when he talks about the French Revolution and how these ideas of the French Revolution led into this horrible mess, and he was writing about aesthetic education as a way of refining character, so that whenever people thought they had a good idea, they would go and produce this terrible mess that they produced when they took it too seriously somehow. And it's also in part connect to an argument, which is again why, I didn't have time to elaborate too much on why Schiller is there, but it's also connected to a discussion around Kant's moral philosophy and the fact that Kant's, that particular framework is often accused of being abstract and arid and formalistic, and again, forcing this really difficult idea of moral duty that doesn't tolerate sensibility or doesn't make space for joy, doesn't make sense for feelings, it's just like really constraining. And I think there's a whole debate around Schiller and this discussion around aesthetic education, which is exactly on art as the means through which you can refine moral ideals, but in a way that doesn't produce the kinds of constraints that people who are worried about the implications of that framework are. So that bit of the talk all came from there. But what's behind it, the thought behind it is the following that Schiller has and that I share, which is in circumstances of ongoing injustice, of societies that are still divided and still polarized and so on, you can't really have reconciliation for the past because the past always carries in the present. And so you think you're dealing with the past, but actually the tensions of the present and the conflicts of the present make reconciliation with the past really, really difficult. So since the state or politics or in a way the societies in which we live can't offer that, this was Schiller's thought, then where do you turn to if you're thinking about, okay, where do I find hope for one day reconciling or for people one day realizing that there is this moral standpoint that goes beyond their particular individual interests and particularly the manipulation or the propaganda, whatever. And he says that art is that. And I think I want to kind of hang on to that idea, even though I completely take your point that all art is as well subject of propaganda and manipulation and distorted by, in many ways, by the status quo. But I still think that there is, I kind of believe in the Enlightenment as an idea. I think there is still room for being enlightened, and art is the sort of vehicle, one of the vehicles through which you can hope for that enlightenment.
Yes, thanks so much for the talk. I think, if I may, the book should open with the great exaggeration of grandmother's death. I think that should start in the first person rather than third person. But that's just, I found it so striking as a room for historical record. I wondered if we could ask about the different indignities that are mentioned in the book, right? Because in the chapter, the way it's set up, I thought it was going to be mostly about this unmixing process and this forced population movement. But in the sort of verbal postscript you had in the talk, it felt a lot more like it was about what followed, what ensued afterwards. Namely the whole political regime in Albania and the record keeping that were wrong, and the whole arbitrariness of it all and how it touched life. Because in a way, they're both very crushing experiences. So I wonder whether you see them as part of the same indignity or separate ones, and if they're separate, what does it then tell us about how to reconcile those things?
Yeah. So I think it's a part of the history, but it's also a part of the history that is telling you a story about dignity and what people thought could give dignity, namely belonging, political belonging. So in a way, I'm trying to have this discussion on dignity that moves at two levels. One is individual and the other one is political and collective. And but it's a very skeptical story about the state, and in a way about, and to some extent also a very disenchanted view of the state and how identity is constructed in those circumstances. So I think these chapters about the unmixing of peoples and so on, which continue then into when you move to Albania, talking about the state in Albania and how record keeping happened, and when she has to register and become a citizen. And so there's always this moment of where are you from? Where do you come from? This follows her all her life, even when she moves to the state that she's told is her state, because she constantly has to make a case for why you belong here rather than somewhere else. So this account of individual and collective dignity is throughout, and the story is instrumental to moving at both levels.
They are hugely looking forward to the book. Two questions, I think. Number one, why are you provisionally entitling it indignity when almost everything you've told us for the last hour and a half is about how human beings can preserve dignity even in conditions of oppression, suffering, etc. Which, by the way, your whole conception of dignity seems to be a refutation of the Jeremy Walden conception of dignity as something object rather than subject. Question number two, even simpler. Did your grandmother ever talk to you directly or indirectly about her ideas about dignity?
Yeah, I'll start with the second. Thank you. Yes, she did, and it was always connected to this idea of preserving your moral agency throughout adverse circumstances in a way. And I think this is why I have it actually, because I grew up with it. And so this notion that, and when I was a child, we were still in communism, and I think my parents, because they knew that I could only advance so much, or they didn't think that the wall would fall and that the society of the world would change and so on. So they had a sense that your avenues for development were very, very limited. And so it was very important that you didn't connect good behavior to achievement or to results, because you couldn't get any results. So it was very important to them that you didn't become completely demoralized by realizing at some point in your life that you couldn't advance because you came from this family and you went through this, you had this background, and that you associated moral worth or dignity with effort. and with effort in adversity. So this is something that was instilled in me very early on, in part because of how they were interpreting in some ways the world for me, in part because this is how they had survived themselves, and in part because this is how my grandmother, I think, had made sense of all these different crises of her life. And I can imagine it's not easy to, you're born in this aristocratic privileged background in the Ottoman Empire in Salonika, and then you suddenly end up in this little town, Kavaya, near Duros. It's not even a main city in Albania, in a group of kind of deported, almost like a ghetto where only deported people are, and the husband in prison and so on. You have to have a sense of making meaning out of your life, out of this kind of meaninglessness. And that was for her connected to this abstract notion of morality, which I then went on to develop and wrote about and researched about philosophically. So, and in part, I think that explains also why I provisionally called the book Indignity, although I'm not that set on the title yet, but because it's not, you can only see dignity in undignified circumstances. So the story of the book is a story of someone that tries to assert her agency in a world that isn't a world where people behave in a dignified way, or where there is very much dignity, or where there's room for finding it. You don't find it. What you see empirically is always indignity. And then dignity shines through when you are fighting indignity in a way. And that was the rationale behind. I mean, it was called dignity at one point, and I changed it to indignity. I might go back to dignity, but
Call it in space, dignity.
well, I had that idea, so my agent rejected that. But, I actually had indignity as a separate word. So in and then dignity as living in dignity, but also in dignity anyway. So those can be too complicated for the trade world or whatever.
Okay, going back again, yes.
Hi, yeah. So after all this research, did the idea of your grandmother or your family change for you? And when is the book Dignity or Indignity coming out?
Thank you. So did my grandmother's idea, yes, it changed for me, and not in a nice way sometimes, because you always have an expectation of a person, and then you find things said about the person in the files or in the records, and so there was one example where I recently discovered, I was trying to find the time at which she was employed in the Albanian ministry. She was, as I mentioned, she was one of the first Albanian woman to work in the kind of civil service. So I was trying to find the dates of when she was in civil service, and I discovered that she, during fascism, had decided just not to go to work, and somehow had left her job. But she was still being paid, because I found a document that said Demalup is now fired because she hasn't presented herself to the job for however many months. And I thought, oh, this is the kind of person that would have kept getting a salary, even though she was not really going to this office job anymore, right? And so I had this moment of kind of questioning myself, saying, why did she keep getting the money if she wasn't going? And then, of course, there are lots of different answers that you can give to that, which maybe she didn't want to say that she was sabotaging the job, or maybe she couldn't make it clear, or whatever. There's both moral and immoral ways of making sense of it. But there are certainly, when you confronted with the archives, there are certainly elements that you find about someone else's life that aren't necessarily pleasant, or they're discomforting in many ways. They're, the Germans have a nice word, unheimlich, it's kind of perturbing. And I certainly found that, and the only way in which I could make peace with that was when I decided, okay, this is a character. It's not really about my grandmother. It's not about my relationship to her. This book has a general purpose that readers don't have to care about with my emotional relationship to this character and what I think about her. But I certainly needed to detach myself a bit, because there were lots of, this is an even more, in some ways, dramatic example, but which was resolved. When I filed the request to the Albanian Secret Service to see my family's archive documents, I received this email saying, we found the papers with your grandmother's name, with your grandfather's name, and with your father's name. And they said, we have 600 pages on your father, on my father. And this was, again, a moment where you think 600 pages, only a spy would have 600 pages. So only someone who was actively reporting on someone else would have such a long file, because he didn't go to prison himself. There was no reason to suspect that he would have such a long file. And so this was only someone who could actually actively produce this. So for a couple of days, I had this idea, well, maybe my father was a spy. And again, it's not, if you've grown up with this idea that the spies are the horrible people who've done all this horrible things to your family in this kind of post-communist scenario, it's not a nice feeling to contemplate that, your father might be a spy. And it was made worse by the fact that when I asked my mom, who is still around, my father's not around, I asked my mom, do you think Dad might have been a spy? at some point, she said, what do you want to know? And so again, there was this desire to find out, coupled with this idea that maybe there's something that you shouldn't know about people that are too close to you. And I think this is a general rule, actually, we should never try and find out too much about people that are close to us.
Okay, let's turn to Renee Herschel now, who knows a thing or two about mixing and unmixing populations, yeah?
I'm absolutely fascinated by your approach to this, and the response from everybody shows how you've got us thinking about looking at the past in a different way. I would like to make a suggestion. I've been trying to restrain myself from getting a commissioning editor to do a meta study of you, according to the criteria that have come up, like silence, memory, your agency, individuality. And I think in a way you've put yourself on, up for scrutiny. You've done a wonderful job by provoking us into thinking it through again. And I really would be interested at your backstory, and the fact that you mentioned Facebook and that photograph is very interesting, because I've had some provocations to some of my work, and I'm writing backstories now. But why did I write that article? Or why was I interested in Greeks telling lies to children? Well, my little boy was growing up there and was being told endless fantasies about, which were lovely, games with words. So that's the one response I have to you. The other one has to do with silence, and also relates to what Othon said about these groups that have not been the subject of scrutiny up to now. Yesterday, I went to, by Zoom, I was at a seminar in Athens on the Muslims of Crete who were deported according to the Treaty of Lausanne, and whose fate is very little known. There's one person who's researched them. She gave the paper, and she's done a chapter in the book called Crossing the Aegean. But she obviously, from what she said, has been in long-term contact with them. There are all kinds of stories about how they adjusted and what they did. So that particular interesting thing that we're in a period now whereby people who are not being paid attention are getting some attention, and that's great. And I had one question at that particular meeting yesterday, which is about silence. What happens when people are expelled and disappear? What is left of them? And I know from my own research on the Jewish community in Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, when I first went there, nobody knew anything about them. They had absolute ignorance, even though they had a memorial to the Jewish martyrs in the main square of the old town. And I also asked myself about in Breckenlon, which is where a lot of these Muslim Cretans came from. I wanted to ask Michael Hertzfeld, who's there, what did people say about the disappeared Muslims? I didn't get an answer, he wasn't there. So I'm leaving that as an answer, a question. What do we say about the people who disappeared?
Yeah, I mean, there's also something, sorry, my sound was in. One of the things to say about disappeared people is that sometimes even the people who have not disappeared, there are parts of them that have disappeared to themselves. And this is, I find, really the real mystery and the tragedy of these expelled people or people who have gone through trauma and so on. So there are very few people who lived in Salonika at the time in which I'm writing, but I tried to track all of them down and ask them interviews and so on. And what I notice is that when you change state or when you're told you belong here, there is a part of yourself that disappears, not just to the world, but also to yourself. And you just don't, but you don't want to talk about it anymore, and you forget it because it's so difficult and you have to adjust somehow. This I think also applies to migrants now in contemporary societies. Everyone who migrates, there is a part of themselves that they have to cancel in order to fit and to survive and to integrate somehow. And what I noticed, for example, about these relatives from Salonika who had lived in Salonika, and one in particular, I was trying to, he's almost completely blind and almost completely deaf, and it's very, very old. And I was trying to tell him, just tell me what you remember anything from Salonika in the time in which you were a child, around the time of the population exchanges, anything. And he would, and it was all done by voice messages on WhatsApp. He's in Italy, some recorded the voice message and then sent it back to me. And I kept getting these voice messages that just weren't specific. He would say to me, I grew up in this, there was the Armenian church, and then there were some shops, but I don't remember the name of the road, and I don't remember this, and I don't remember this. He talked about the generics that I could have had from looking at maps or from reading history books or from looking at the archives. I mean, I knew the urban lay of the city. So it's not that I was asking, can you tell me where was the Armenian church? Because I knew where the Armenian church. I wanted to know his experience of going to the Armenian church. And that he would not talk about. And I suspect it's not that he didn't want to talk about it, because he didn't want to talk about it with me. It's just that he didn't remember. That part of him was dead to himself in a way. And that's another thing about identity, that it's not, even the people who are alive aren't alive in all the parts of themselves. There are some parts of us that are gone forever and maybe come back with some mechanisms or whatever, but with art or with literature or with history, but not always. And yeah, it's not a given.
We've got another 5 minutes. Yes.
Yes. I would appreciate if you could give us some more clues about your non-positivist normative conception of dignity. You hinted at, I think, 2 criteria. The first one being moral agency, and the second one being the fact that we shouldn't expect for any kind of reward. But I was wondering if we can think of dignity without elaborating on a fixed conception of the good. And did you elaborate in this book on a conception of the good? Because we could think that you can use your moral agency and without expecting any reward, but still not be a dignified person if you use your individual autonomy to make bad things in your life without expecting anything. But so I would like you to give it.
Can we do 2 more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, right about. Yep.
I was thinking about the concept of truth. So you mentioned earlier that you were searching for truth in the arguments. And you mentioned a bit later that there were different interpretations to the evidence that you found. So I was wondering if you could expand on this notion of truth, if you clearly found any truth and what you think that is.
Yeah.
And
very, very last question. As I stand, I'm Polish, and I am familiar with your feelings about the security, police archives, and so on. And as a doctor as well, I was struck by your comments that don't research your own close people, like we don't treat our families, as doctors, so this is good, interesting, comparative with historian and doctor. But what is the quality of this archive? Because we know that in Polish archives there's a lot of manipulation. We also mentioned about this kind of confabulation by secret officers. And what's the general kind of understanding of today of the quality, with the Kennedys way quality?
Of the quality
of the archives,
yeah,
and access to them as well.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I'll start with the last question. It's basically the general discussion is that they are not accessible enough, that they need to be more accessible, and that we need to find out more about who was implicated in particular actions. But the general discussion is also very narrow, and it's often manipulated for political purposes by particular elites who are, whoever happens to be in power at that point in time will have an instrumental argument that they will make against the other side. But it's usually, I don't think the process is really at the service of either justice or reconciliation or truth for that matter. It's all kind of point scoring, trying to put the rivals in difficulty. And so using history for political instrumental elite manipulation, basically, and that's the discussion. So even when it takes the form of, what is the quality of the archives? Are they accessible? Are they not accessible? It's because the settling of accounts is often done in this finger-pointing way, where you need to find if this politician who is now claiming to go to office, was he ever implicated, or was his grandfather, or was his father, or his uncle ever implicated? So it's done in this very an eye for an eye sort of thing, which isn't really the approach that I'm taking in the book. It's my approach trying to be very different from that. And this is also partly, hopefully, the intervention is to say there is actually no truth of that kind that you can find, and it's not going to be helpful if you think about justice and reconciliation in those terms. How I think about truth, I think of it as a process, but I don't think of the truth as something that you start with, and I don't have a kind of correspondence theory of truth. So I don't think there are things that are already true and that we need to access. I think of it as a process of kind of making increasingly plausible statements about the world, both empirical, scientific, and moral. So in this, it's in my notion of truth is in this pragmatic tradition that thinks of truth as something that you construct progressively as you move along and as you move forward. And about the good and my conception of dignity, I mean, the great thing about writing literature is that you don't have to have a conception of the good. And in fact, what the book tries to do is to present lots of different views of also dignity and of lots of different goods, and that you can actually have a conversation around different ways of life. But I do have a conception of the good that I think is connected to this notion of dignity as moral agency that I was talking about, which is reward for virtuous behavior. So there is a whole literature that reflects on the notion of the good, and indeed in Kant it's called the highest good because it's the combination of virtue and happiness. And that is a notion of the good that isn't dependent on satisfaction for the right action, but it's dependent on knowing that you have done your duty. And so it's almost a more kind of Protestant notion of the good. It's not, doesn't depend on how you get there. It's more about the conditions under which you can fulfill your obligations. And that's the conception of the good that I find appealing. But, you know, I don't have to, the great thing about, as I say, writing in this mode is that you don't have to have an answer to that kind of question, because the whole point is not to settle it. And as I say, the minute literature tries to settle that kind of question, it becomes terrible literature, but I think it becomes also generally oppressive.
Thank you very much. And before I thank our speaker, I would just like to say that we've got a very rich program. Look at it in case you're interested. But there are two particular seminars that I would like to draw the attention because they are connecting to the discussion that we're having today. One of them is with René Herschen, who is going to talk to us about the republication of her book, Heirs of the Greek Catastrophe, for the Asia Minor exchange population. And there's another one on the securitization of migration to the dehumanization of refugees. That's another one that we're having, which is very close to the issues of dignity that we've been discussing today. Now, with that, first let me thank Marilena because you've been a wonderful discussant, and we really appreciate it. You gave us this very, very eloquent and elegant commentary, but most of all you for letting us into your philosophical world, also letting us into your family secrets. Before you allow anybody else. Yes, that's why they're secrets. And thank you for speaking fast because that allowed for a lot of questions. What's the purpose of this? Hopefully you've got some feedback. I will all rush to buy the book. It sounds fascinating. Thank you very much, Leah, for coming today.